Okay, guys, how's it going? We're going to do this quickly because I'm running out of daylight, basically, even though it doesn't look like it on the screen. Um, Blood of Elves by Andrzej Sapkowski actually took me a bit by surprise. I mentioned in the review there that when I read this the first time, I did rate it 4 stars and now rated it 5. There were a few things the first time round that did confuse me that I now understood on a second read. And I don't know if that's just because I've grown as a reader and I was reading it a little slower because I was doing it in book form, not on Kindle and whatever, or if it's just because it's a reread and I kind of understand what's going on. I think there are a lot of things when they introduce a lot of the kings and their different kingdoms. A lot of that is hard to follow. I think it's hard to keep track of who is who because the names are all, they're not like easy names to remember, and they sort of are introduced in a vacuum altogether without much context for who each one is. Like Foltest is the easiest one to remember because Foltest is the king that you are already familiar with from the first short story, and if you've played the video games, then you're familiar with Foltest. You'll probably be familiar with Henselt as well if you played The Witcher 2, because he's a big part of that. And but that's sort of besides the point. I think the second time round it really didn't bother me at all, and I don't know if that had an impact on my rating, but I think definitely just the humor in this book is just something that's just delighted me while reading it. Like the shenanigans, like the whole series really is just, it can be described as Geralt and his friends get into shenanigans and along the way unravel a conspiracy. So spoilers really from this point onwards, guys. Obviously, I warned you in the last video, and it's obviously on the title and everything, but some people need to be told a third time, so spoilers ahead basically from here on out. So let's talk about how the book starts. I noticed, it took me a while to really notice this, but the series uses an omniscient narrator, and I don't know why it took me so long to realise that, because one of the things that I love is when it cuts to different characters that are in the future or the past, and it gives this extra context to things. And I think that's something Sapkowski uses really well to create humour in the series, because there are characters who will realise things. It would be like, something will happen, like this isn't a direct quote, but this is like an example of something that will happen. It'd be like someone will do something, and then it will be like, and in 30 years, like so and so has reflected on this day and realized what a dick that guy was. Like, that's obviously not an exact example, but that's the sort of thing that he does quite a lot. And in the beginning of this book, it opens with Dandelion telling the story of Geralt finding Ciri after the war. And the way it's described, I think this is one of the things that confused me, because coming off the back of the short stories, Geralt finds Ciri in like a hut in a field and it's all fine. But I think in the beginning of this, it like describes him finding her on a battlefield or something. But yeah, like it's difficult because obviously Ciri has gone through a lot of things at the start of this book, and it opens with Dandelion, and it's just this brilliant scene of all these people like arguing with each other about whether Nilfgaard is like should be fucking fought again. It's like, we all fought there, and all these guys are arguing. They're all arguing with each other about who was the most brave in this battle. And they were like, we were all there, mate. Like, this guy's like, I was there on the battlefields. I fought Nilfgaard, and like everyone else is like, yeah, mate. We were all there. For fuck's sake, it was a huge war. And it's like, it's just so funny. And like Dandelion uses the opportunity to just nick the money and fuck off, which is a typical Dandelion thing to do. I thought that was a great opening. It really introduced this sort of this satirical angle to politics that it takes. And then we get the scene with Rience torturing Dandelion, which Rience is like this villain who is not like, he's always like this almost incompetent villain. He can never really achieve anything correctly. Every time he appears, he's like swiftly thwarted, which is why he's not the strongest of villains, but he doesn't really need to be, because he's like, obviously he's a puppet of this conspiracy that's going on. Obviously I won't spoil it for people who have not read past this book, but we do get a lot more, like we find out shit like who Rience's master is and all that stuff. Rience is like this puppet, he's nothing. But I just find it funny, like every time he appears, he ends up getting fucking his ass kicked. And this happens later on. He hires these guys, he hires like 5 brothers, or like 4, is it 4 or 5? I think it's 4. He hires 4 brothers who are like professional killers. He's like, go kill this guy. He's a random guy, and he sends them to kill Geralt. And like the guy's like, this is one of the things like what I was talking about. Like the guy, he takes the money, and then he's like, oh, there's obviously a catch, I want more. And Rience is just like, oh yeah, sure, no problem. And then the guy, it just cuts and it says, oh, it was at that moment that the guy realised that he clearly didn't ask for enough for how much of a catch there was to this job. And obviously Geralt destroys them all, because of course he does. He's Geralt of fucking Rivia. And then raising Ciri and Kaer Morhen, all of the stuff with Vesemir and Lambert and Cohen is just, and Eskel as well, it's delightful. Like Ciri comes down, like the witches don't understand. Like they're these guys, you know, they train little boys to be these mutant monster hunters, and suddenly they've got this girl, and they're like, well, fuck, what do we do? So they just do, you know, what they always do, that will feed us some mushrooms. We'll feed us some fucking accelerate mushrooms, and it will make her strong. And it makes her strong and shit, but it like fucks up her menstrual cycle. And like Triss, like they get Triss in because Geralt he's not talking to Yennefer at this point, so he gets Triss Merigold in, who doesn't really have a huge role in the series. It's a weird thing, like Triss is such a huge part of the game, that I would thought when I read it the first time that she'd be a major character, but she's really not. But she's great because like she comes in and like immediately she's like, what the fuck have you done? Like she's talking to Ciri and she's like, do you even realize like men and women have different physiologies, guys. You can't do this. And they're making her do this hard training, like, while she's on her period. And then Triss is like, you really can't do that. And then she's like, wear this dress. And then Vesemir's like, okay, guys, every time she's wearing a dress, we can't let her train, because that means she's indisposed. And like, people give Sarah J Maas so much credit for like talking about menstruating in a fantasy book, but like fucking Andrei Sapkowski did it, guys. And he was like a grumpy old man in the 90s, so it's not all that unique, you know. It was interesting to see that there. And then after we get out of Kaer Morhen, there's a lot of sweet things that happen in Kaer Morhen. You know, Ciri and Geralt obviously have a very father-daughter relationship, but Geralt doesn't really he doesn't know what to do, and I think that obviously annoys Ciri because she has such a strong drive, but Geralt is like this kind of guy who's like, you know, just be a witcher, don't worry about any of that. And she's like, well, I want to get revenge for my family. He's like, nah, don't do that, don't bother. And there's an interesting dynamic between them. They clearly love each other, and that's the thing, like they clearly love each other a lot, and that is such a strong throughout the series, which is adorable. But after we get out of Kaer Morhen, there's my favourite thing ever, which is the dysentery subplot. Like Triss gets some sort of disease on the road where she just gets diarrhea. And like they can't do anything because no one's around, and they get to this fortress and they're like, oh well, you've got some bad luck there, mate, because like, all of our blokes have just been attacked by these fucking elf rebels, so she's just gonna have to have diarrhea. So they go off and they meet the dwarves in the forest, and this was a really interesting part of the book where they just sort of travel and you learn a lot about these Scoia'tael, and all of the politics around non-humans, and how they interplay with Nilfgaard and stuff. All of that was really fascinating world building, and it also just gave birth to a whole huge load of other fun character moments. Ciri just annoying dwarves on the road, Triss obviously being indisposed at this point, and Geralt just being a grumpy, non-committal guy. And that was one of the big themes of the book, is staying neutral in scenarios where the world is basically teetering on the edge of war. At this point, it's just come out of a huge conflict. Triss and Geralt have huge arguments about this, like loads of times in the book. Like, Geralt is one of those guys who's like, it's not my fight, it's not what I do. And Triss's argument is, well, if you don't fight, you're treating. Basically, she says to the witches, like, you are treating the symptoms of a disease and not the cause. And Geralt says it's not his job to fight the cause. And there's all this talk about neutrality, and how Geralt won't step in. But again, like, straight away, we see how that's tested and proven false with Geralt, because he always preaches about this. I'm going to be neutral. I'm going to stay neutral. But when it comes down to it, he can't help but intervene. He can't help himself. He will always stand up for really his friends and what he thinks is right. And that holds true in this. And if you've never read the short stories, it's a great introduction to his character, really. Moving on from that, all the stuff with Ciri in Elender, sort of learning more, basically. She is obviously very precocious, and then she gets introduced to Yennefer there. And being introduced to Yennefer is probably one of the defining moments of Ciri's life, because for once, she's not dealing with someone who doesn't really know what they're doing, who isn't scared or intimidated by her. Yennefer is a character who she doesn't give a shit. She's doing this as a favour to Geralt. And obviously, a big part of Yennefer's character is her desire to be a mother, and not being able to. And Ciri really opens a window for her to be able to do at least some of that. There's a great relationship that builds between them as the story goes on. I still think her relationship with Geralt is a bit weak, but I loved the letter. There's an indication that Geralt sent Yennefer this really fucking formal letter that he was like, it says like, oh, Geralt struggled for weeks and weeks to come up with the beginning of the letter and settled on "Dear Friend" as the opening line. And like, there's this really fucking passive aggressive letter he gets from Yennefer that's just talking about, "Dearest friend, I'm so glad you picked me second to help raise Ciri. You are truly a dear friend." And it's like, it's so awkward, but it's brilliant. Like, if you've ever watched the UK Office, or Extras or anything like that, any of the like real classic cringe Ricky Gervais cringe comedies, that's what we're getting with Geralt and Yennefer at this stage, and it's pretty damn brilliant. Then, of course, there's all the interesting world-building stuff with the conspiracy and the spies. Like, spying is a huge part of being in the Witcher world. A lot of the warfare is done by these intelligence agencies, and we get introduced to Dijkstra, who is a huge part of the novels. He is obviously leaning on Dandelion, who we find has been spying for like everyone in the kingdom, but whoever will give him a copper to do so, basically. And he's doing his shenanigans with Dijkstra, who's trying to find Ciri. Basically, everyone's trying to get hold of Ciri for their own nefarious ends, and Dijkstra is no exception. And we also get introduced to all the kings who are doing their own conspiracy, who they think they're really fucking smart. They're like, we're going to do like a false flag. Basically, they're like, we're going to do a false flag attack on this Nilfgaard outpost so that we can have an excuse to go over the border and fuck them up. It's interesting. One of my friends was talking to me about, there's a lot of these, Sapkowski takes a lot of asides to make allusions to like the war, like World War II especially. And being Polish, I can sort of understand why that would be a big focus for him. But it's interesting, like, I didn't really think about it the first time round, but now seeing this the second time, like, when all the kings are talking about Nilfgaard, like, they're talking about how Nilfgaard has expanded, and they expand and they push the boundaries until they're pushed back, which is exactly sort of what Germany did at the beginning of World War II. Like, they took all of this land, they invaded after place after place after place, and no one stood up against them to stop them. And they're talking about, like, we need an alliance of nations to stop these guys. It's very World War II, with, like, Nilfgaard being the role of Nazi Germany in this instance. I'd be interested to know if any of you guys thought the same about the parallels there between World War II and the Witcher sort of war scenario that's going on. But the best thing for me about the King conspiracy is that they're so out of their depth. They don't really know what's going on. They're like squabbling children. And then, like, almost immediately, like, someone says to, like, a sorcerer, like, it's like Vilgefortz, who's like the head sorcerer. Like, they say to, like, Vilgefortz, like, oh yeah, like, the kings have got this plan, and he's like, oh, fucking whatever, let them plan, let them scheme, it's irrelevant to me. And it's quite brilliant, like, how these different layers are there, because, like, there's this huge devoted chunk to the kings scheming to each other, and then, like, it almost immediately it's just undercut with, like, all of those guys are dumb. And it's just so it's so weird and refreshing for a big fantasy series, because most epic fantasies do involve, like, the heads of nations fighting each other, but that's not what this is about. And it's quite interesting to see that sort of pulled away scope from that sort of stuff. And then in the end of the book, Geralt fights some guys. I talked about it earlier as these brothers that Rience hires to, like, track him down, because it's the easiest way to get to Ciri. And they're just trying to execute him at this point. Like, whoever is in control of Rience has just told him, like, just get him executed. Like, Rience is ostensibly working for Nilfgaard, I think, at this stage. And we do get introduced to the Emperor of Nilfgaard, is that Emirvar Emrys. I think it's him who just commands him to kill Geralt. I think that's correct. Yeah, so Rience is sort of working for Nilfgaard, but he has, like, a mysterious benefactor as well. And we know that he's working for Nilfgaard, and Nilfgaard's like, just kill Geralt, like, whatever, who cares? So he tries to, and it doesn't end well for him. So that's good. So yeah, it was a nice little way to, like, end it off with a bit of an action scene at the climax, because there's not a huge amount of fighting before that. There is, like, a little battle scene. And then, yeah, it just sort of, it ends with Yennefer and Ciri being just going on the road together, because, like, they're going to Aretuza, which is the witchcraft school, but I don't think we learn that in this book. That's more in the second book, which is Time of Contempt, which was actually my least favourite of the Witcher books on the first read, but it'd be interesting now to see on a reread if that remains true. So thank you for listening. My voice is obviously going on me again, because it's been almost 20 minutes of rambling about this book. Really enjoyed it, guys. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you thought of Blood of Elves in the comments below if you've read it, and if you haven't, well, I don't know why you have watched this whole video up to this point. And I will see you next time. I don't know what that will be. It will either be Friday. Hope if my voice is better, I might do a fun Friday. Haven't really got an idea for a fun Friday this week, but hopefully that'll be it. Otherwise, I have a massive rant ahead of you for Sit Down Saturday, which I do have something in mind for, but I'm not going to film today because my voice is fucked, and I want to do a little bit more sort of research about the topic before I go into it. So that was it, guys, for me. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe and like if you enjoyed this or whatever, and I will see you in the future. Goodbye.